Hello, I am Lynn Johnson, an OCVN or Ohio Certified Volunteer Naturalist. I volunteer for the Springboro Park System to lead some nature hikes in some of the parks. This spring, our scheduled hikes have been canceled because of the coronavirus situation. So I've decided to put together some virtual hikes, which will allow us to see what's going on in our parks without having to um, go out and hike through the parks. You don't have to worry about getting muddy or getting bothered by insects or poison ivy or going up and down the hills. You can just enjoy the park. Today we're featuring Milo Beck Park, which has two distinct habitats or ecosystems. One is the prairie, which is the subject of a different program, and this one is the Riparian Corridor. Now, Riparian Corridor is a fancy word that just means the land along the river. So the parking lot is up here at the top of the map. This dotted area down through the center is the prairie. This hike is going to start down here at the bottom because I previously hiked through the prairie to take pictures for that. And then I'm going to follow the trail up along the Clear Creek here and then back up here to the parking lot. So let's get started on our virtual hike in the Riparian Corridor. Riparian simply means the land along the river. I think I said that. Okay, as I'm starting out, we can see that there are lots of trees here. And first thing we see is a big dark spot up there in that tree in the center. You get a closer look at it and we see some twigs and a lot of leaves in there. This looks like a nest and acts like a nest, and it really is a nest, but it has a special name. It's called a dray. This is the nest used by a squirrel for its home. So starting along toward the river here, which is not really a river, but the Clear Creek, we find that there are flowers blooming in this area. This one is a pretty little flower, but we'd really rather not have so many of them around. This is garlic mustard, and it's considered to be an invasive plant. It produces lots of seeds and grows very easily from them. This one is wild blue phlox. It's very similar, very closely related to the phlox that you could buy at a nursery store for your garden, but these grow native in our woodlands. This one is the spring beauty. It's quite a small flower, and they're just about done at the time in mid-April when I took these photographs. There's not, probably by the time you see this, there wouldn't be any of them out there anymore. Violets. This one's not blooming yet, but these leaves tell me that this is one called the Solomon seal. And since we're talking about a waterway of the Clear Creek, here we have some ducks and fish. It's hard to tell from this photograph. These little minnows are smaller than my little finger. Probably a lot of them are an inch or inch and a half long, something like that. And I'm going to take quite a few pictures of the creek as we go along here. I won't necessarily comment on each one. There is a trail that follows along through here, generally in this wooded area next to the creek. This little plant is called wild ginger. It is not the same as the ginger whose roots are used in Oriental cooking. I think this is marsh marigold, but there's a couple of other similar plants that are quite hard to distinguish from it. And I didn't have my flower books with me when I took these pictures. Sometimes the trail has to go around because Mother Nature decided that maybe this was a good place for a tree to lay down. Trout lilies, mostly done blooming. One of the things we find along the riparian corridors are large trees. These trees do a couple of things. They help anchor the soil. but they're also trees that can survive being wet part of the year. As we'll see a little later on, some of the area where this trail is actually in the floodplain of the river or the creek here. With the light colored bark there, that tells us that this is a sycamore tree. Here's another ginger plant. You can see the little tiny bloom down here getting started. It isn't opened up yet, but it will be soon after this. That flower stays very close to the ground because this plant is pollinated by crawling insects rather than flying insects. We find indications that there's lots of living things around here besides plants. This shell's been laying around for quite a while. That's been kind of eroded by the water, but there are snails along the creek. Little tributary feeding into the creek there. To look at a picture like this, you wouldn't think that this is a 1.5 miles from Springboro City Hall. And you'll see more of this debris as we go along too. I'll talk about that a little bit later in terms of what that can tell us about this stream. There's lots of things living down here. When you're down here on this gravel, at first you look out there and you say, oh, just a bunch of stones and some sand. And then you see something move and you take a closer look and there's this little spider. He's probably only 1/2 inch across. There were quite a few of them out there. Once you started looking for them, you saw them scurrying around every place down there. And if there's spiders there, there's lots of other things, insects and other small things, because most spiders are predators and they have to have something that they can catch to eat. This little shell was probably 1/4 inch or 3/8 inch across. This one's a little bit bigger. It's about 1 inch across or so. And it had collected a couple little stones of its own. And then I picked it up and dumped the stones out so you could kind of see, and you can see it next to those little shells there. And then I turned it over so you could see the other side. And then after I took these pictures, I noticed that right here to the left, in this stone, there are some little lines there. This is a fossil, probably of some kind of a mollusk or other kind of invertebrate creature, because most of the creatures that lived in the area here that became fossilized were much older than the dinosaurs, and things like the mollusks and trilobites and other things like that were the kinds of animals that are found in our fossils in this area. More storm debris. And notice that this is quite a bit higher than the water. It was maybe just chest high on me when I took that picture. Here's the trail running along the edge of the creek. The creek is to my left here as I'm taking this picture. A phlox and some more Solomon seal. There you can see a close-up of the phlox photo. Here's another violet, but this one isn't blue, this one is white. They also come in yellow. I don't recall whether I saw any yellow ones on this hike or not. Sometimes when you're looking at trees, especially in the winter, early spring, or late fall, there's no leaves there. And so you have to try to identify the tree, if you want to do that, by looking at the bark and the twigs and the shape of the tree. This one is pretty easy. Those deeply defined ridges on the bark make this a hackberry tree. And you can see that those ridges extend quite a ways up the trunk of this tree. This little plant is one that I always think is kind of fun because it demonstrates that many plants were named by what people thought they looked like, not necessarily what they actually did. The little light colored patches on the leaves here, someone thought looked like water spots on the leaf. And so this was called the water leaf plant. It has not bloomed yet. It'll bloom probably in the next few weeks sometime. Here's a trout lily that's actually blooming. These also come in a couple of other colors, particularly yellow. This is the May apple. It has not bloomed yet, and you can see here that this comes with a plant that has one stalk and one leaf. Maybe later on we'll find some that have one stalk that branches out into two leaves. When I take kids out on hikes and from school groups, earlier in the spring when this is first popping up, they say, oh, it looks like an umbrella. Some of them even call it the umbrella plant. I should know what this one is, but I don't recall, and I didn't look it up, but it's pretty. Now here you can see down in the center here, the actual flower of the wild ginger. This one is actually open and blooming. That flower is just basically laying on the ground there so the crawling insects can crawl in there and pollinate it. Remember we looked at that storm debris or flood debris earlier in one of those photographs? Well, you can see this horizontal line across here, about halfway up this bank. That's a line that was scoured by water. So that water's been that high, not necessarily the last time it was through here, but water's been up that high enough that it washed things away from this bank at various times. You can see over here at the left where it didn't scour here because there's growing things there. I'll show you a little bit later that roots do a great job of helping to hold on to the soil. This redbud was across the creek from where I was. Here you can kind of see the roots holding on to the soil and the rocks there. Otherwise, this tree probably would have washed away a long time ago, but those roots have helped anchor it to that point. And again, you can see some of that debris quite a bit higher than the level of the water. That doesn't have anything to do with flood. It's just a tree that came down across the creek there. This is a lovely little plant. It has a very delicate leaf, stems, and so forth. You can see the stem coming up there to the flower is really tiny. These vibrate very easily in any kind of a breeze, so they're always moving a little bit. This is called the Roux Anemone. And sometimes things wash down the creek that we'd really rather not have in there. You can also see some tracks where somebody's dog was down in there having fun. Dogs love this. If you go down there and you find people out there walking their dogs and they're coming back from their walks in the park, the dogs are always wet. And here I took this picture and said, wow, look at that duck standing out there. And what I didn't notice until I got back home and started looking at these pictures was that not only was the duck there, but he had a friend back here behind on the right. A great blue heron was standing back there. Unfortunately, I didn't have the camera focused exactly right, so the picture of the heron's not very clear. And even in this blown up version, the duck's not all that clear. But the heron is a bird that can be 4 feet tall. He wades around in shallow waters and uses that long spear-like beak to catch fish or other aquatic animals and eats them. They're very fascinating birds to watch. When they catch a fish, they'll just kind of flip it up in the air and swallow it, that hole down that long skinny neck that they have. I told you that May apples come with a branching stem. This happens when they're 2 years old, and they get a flower in there. That flower blooms and produces a little fruit that'll come along toward the end of May. And then after that fruit has set seed, that plant will die. So it lives 2 years. So 1 leaf the first year, 2 leaves the second year, and then it's done. More Roux Anemone along the trail there. Here's another lovely, lovely flower that occurs in the springtime. This one's called the Virginia Bluebells. Not a lot of them down here, but there are some, and they have these lovely little flowers. The flowers, each flower is about 1 inch long, And if you catch a big patch of those all blooming at the same time, it can be a pretty spectacular sight. This little plant that also has just one leaf is called the bloodroot, and it's long done blooming. It's it was probably blooming back in March, and by now the flowers are long gone. A lot of them have set seed. There are some pretty big trees down here. This is the base of a big sycamore tree. And again, you can see the light colored bark up there that shows that it was a sycamore. Sycamores love to have wet feet, so they germinate, their seeds germinate around water, so they're always found near water. This is what's known as a dead tree. This particular tree is an ash tree, and it was killed by an invasive insect, the emerald ash borer. Many of you have probably heard of that. These little grooves here in the trunk of the tree were carved by the larva of that emerald ash borer as it worked its way through the tree. This part of the tree where these grooves are is the part where the sap flows up and down the tree. And so since these grooves zigzag back and forth horizontally, they get to the point where they cut off the flow of sap vertically through the tree, and then the tree dies. Once the ash borer gets into an ash tree, the tree is usually going to be dead within 3 to 5 years. These ash borers came from Asia, and we've not found a reliable, inexpensive way to stop them. We've lost most of our ash trees. This plant is the Myrtle, and it is by most authorities considered to be not native, but nobody really objects to it too much. It's not as aggressive and invasive plant as some others. If you get a close-up look at it, you can see those little tiny tendrils of roots coming out of the stem of the vine there and latching onto the bark of that tree to hold that against the tree. This duck didn't have a heron for a buddy. More Roux Anemone. And now we're just about to the end of the places where we can easily see the creek, but you can see there that there were a couple of people down there enjoying that part of the creek. There is a sign here. You can walk right up to the grass there and fall in the water if you're not careful. So if you stay on the trail, you're fine. I didn't see too many birds well, actually I heard a lot of birds, but I didn't get where I could take very many pictures of them, but this little cardinal cooperated. Now we're going to go back up the trail to the parking area and the picnic area up at the top of the park. And the trail that we're going on right now will be this one done by Keen Leahy as his Eagle Scout project. This part of it was pretty easy. Oh, there's some more violets. And now you can see, as we start up here, you can see the stones over here, kind of behind these trees and then on up this way. This black stuff here is called landscape cloth, and it was put in there to help cut down on erosion of the soil. More stones. Those scouts must have put a lot of effort into moving these stones, finding stones and sitting them in here and getting things leveled up, because this keeps going and going and going. And then there's some areas like this that they didn't have stones on that aren't quite as steep, and more steps here. This area, when the soil is wet, can be pretty slippery. And there's some places there where you have to take some big steps. So if you do go down here to Milo Beck Park, and I encourage you to do so, please be careful using this trail when the weather conditions might have that wet. And it stays wet a good bit of the time because this is in the woods. There's a lot of shade here. This is one of our few native evergreen trees, the red cedar, and there's a bunch of them down there. More stones, more steps, more hills. I think there's about a 90-foot elevation change there or something like that. And you come up to the top here, and at the end of the trail there, you can see the little pavilion there that provides an overlook out over the prairie area of Milo Beck Park. And they've got little maps there that loop on that trail actually shows you the route around the prairie. The little squiggly white line there where it says you are here is the switchbacks that we just came up on Keene's Trail there. And so this concludes our little visit to the Riparian Corridor in Milo Beck Park. Thank you for going for a little hike with me today.